So it is my pleasure to introduce a classmate of mine from the Webb School, Miss Erica Wright. Her latest crime novel, The Granite Moth, was called Brisk, Dark, and Slinky by USA Today. 2016 Silver Falcon Award finalist. Her debut, The Red Chameleon, was one of Oprah's magazine Best Books of Summer 2014. She's also the author of poetry collections Instructions for Killing the Jackal and All the Bayou Stories End with Drowned. She's the poetry editor at, I apologize, I don't know how to say this, Guernica magazine, as well as a former editorial board member for Alice James Books. She's taught creative writing at Marymount Manhattan College and Southern New Hampshire University. She grew up in Moortrace, Tennessee, graduated from the Webb School in 1999, great class of 1999, and received her BA from New York University and her MFA from Columbia University. Her new novel, The Blue Kingfisher, will be released this fall. And for me, it's just one of my best friends for 6 years through the Webb School. Miss Erica Wright.
Perhaps you get your news from your most informed friend. Perhaps there's someone who can tell you what's going on with Beyonce. They can tell you who won the Titans game yesterday. There's that person who knows everything. And actually, that has a pretty long history. Before we had newspapers, that is how news was spread. People would talk about it. Of course, then we had the printing press, and I've got this nice old issue of the Boston Daily Globe. That quickly changed to radio, it quickly changed to news programs, and now we have social media, which we know more and more people are getting their news from these different feeds. So you don't have to answer out loud. Just think for a minute, how do you get the majority of your news? And let me be clear, I'm using that pretty broadly. So that could be world events, it could be how did you know something recently, or it could be things that are more, would be considered more fun. So new albums, new movies, things like that. So I wanted to just actually define the idea of the 24-hour news cycle. So we think of the 24-hour news cycle as being a slightly more recent phenomenon. So I bet you've heard this before as young people. You've probably been told that you have short attention spans. You've probably been told that you are doing many things at once. And to a certain extent that's true, but the next time someone brings this up, you can politely remind them that the 24-hour news cycle began actually in the 1960s. So it began with radio. The absolutely first radio to broadcast 24-hour news, there's a bit of a dispute, but it was probably the WAPA in 1961. Then we have one that you might be more familiar with. In the 1980s, there was the rise of cable news. So the very first one was CNN. It's on 24 hours a day, either reporting the news or more frequently commenting on the news. So these programs are a lot of commentary. And then we had a brand new way for news to be circulated in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So there are earlier social media programs, but they didn't really last. So I thought I would share three that are still fairly popular. So Facebook was started in 2004, YouTube in 2005, and then Twitter in 2006. So all fairly recent phenomena. So let's go to this question of attention spans. I'm sure you've heard this before. Everyone's attention span is getting shorter. You've probably been told that very many times. What's actually interesting now is there's been a little bit of a pushback. So the research is really pretty inconclusive. To start with, attention spans are very difficult to measure. So a lot of the studies are a little bit, they're considered a little bit flawed. And the most recent studies show that young people are just as capable of concentrating on a task as people from any other generation. So it kind of relates to the idea of the goldfish having a 3-second memory, which might be something you've heard before, because that is absolutely not true. Goldfish are smart. Goldfish are much smarter than you give them credit for. In fact, they can actually be taught tricks. So I don't know if anyone has a goldfish at home, but you can actually train your goldfish. So if something can be trained, it definitely has a memory longer than 3 seconds. On the other hand, there is a real phenomenon that is causing some problems, which is news fatigue. So a recent poll just this year found that about 68% of Americans feel overwhelmed by the amount of news that they are consuming. The wording there is very important because it's not that they're overwhelmed by the news, they're overwhelmed by the amount of information that they are bombarded with. So I'm sure that anytime you sign into your social media accounts, whether it's Snapchat or Twitter or any of the newer ones, it's a lot of content, right? You can kind of find yourself scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. Either it's friends news or it is current events or it's entertainment news. It's just a lot. And there is this kind of real phenomenon that people are frankly just getting tired. That leads to a couple of other problems. One is that media outlets feel very pressured to produce content at a rapid rate. And that leads to some errors. Anytime you're rushing, anytime you rush an assignment, right, it's probably not going to be your best work. And on the other hand, this last one is really just my view, but I'm going to share it anyway. It means that everyone feels responsible. They feel like they have to have an opinion on absolutely every topic, even if they just heard about it this morning. So just to use a recent example, intelligence. Fact or fiction, do ostriches bury their heads in the sand? Who thinks that's fact? Raise your hand. All right, who thinks it's a myth? Okay, we've got about half and half. It is a myth. It is a myth. Ostriches do not bury their heads in the sand. What happens is they have such kind of large, fluffy bodies and such big, tall heads. So if you're looking at an ostrich at the back of the auditorium, you really actually can't see their necks. So people think that they have buried their heads in the sand. But ostriches and goldfish, much smarter than we're giving them credit for. So how do we slow down? I would argue that we need a little mystery. We need a little mystery in our lives. We need to be comfortable with doubt, that it's okay not to know everything all at once. And poetry can really help us with this. So some of you might have read some poetry by John Keats in one of your classes, your Lit class perhaps. At least maybe you know the name. John Keats only lived to 25, but during his lifetime he produced a lot of poetry, and he also wrote a lot of beautiful, beautiful letters. And in one of them to his brothers, he had just seen a production of Shakespeare's Richard III. And it was phenomenal, but he didn't know why. So he started kind of musing, why am I watching Shakespeare 250 years after he has died? You all are reading it nearly 500 years after Shakespeare's died. What is it, he said, that makes someone a genius? And that's the word he used. What makes someone a genius? The answer might be a little bit surprising. What Keats argues is basically that humility is the most important component. That if you're someone who thinks you already know everything, then you're not very likely to go beyond that. That if you think that you are perfectly happy with how everything exists right now, you're unlikely to invent electricity. You're unlikely to invent a cell phone. You're unlikely to see something that doesn't exist anymore. So he had this beautiful letter, and he said that to be a genius, you have to be comfortable with uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts. That whenever Shakespeare was writing a play, when he was writing King Lear, he wasn't saying I know everything about madness. He was saying, let's explore madness. To update it, one of my favorite poets, Ada Limon, asked this kind of beautiful, beautiful question in an interview recently. And she said, how do I see the big picture and hold all the worlds of pain, and at the same time see all the bright edges of joy? Big question. Not something that you're going to find answered in the news. You're going to find it answered in art. And I'm talking specifically about poetry, but there are a lot of different forms, ways it's possible. And here's the thing. I am not alone in this idea that poetry is becoming more popular. When I put together this presentation a few weeks ago, I was citing a National Endowment of the Art Research from last year, and it had found that poetry readership had increased about 17%. Not bad. Last week, they put out a brand new set of research. Poetry readership in the last 5 years has doubled. That's across demographics, that's across age groups, and there's a lot of also anecdotal evidence to show that growing popularity. So you might know someone who competes in Poetry Out Loud. It's a high school program for students to write and perform their own poems. It's very popular. I'd like to mention Claudia Rankin's book Citizen, which came out in 2014 and spent many, many weeks, tens of dozens of weeks, on the New York Times bestseller list. That's remarkable because the New York Times bestseller list does not have a category for poetry. So they had to put it in the nonfiction column, even though it doesn't fit there. So they had to kind of rearrange their thinking just to accommodate this book. Instagram poetry. Does anyone follow any Instagram poets? Or does anyone write any Instagram poets? I see a few. Yes, they're wonderful. They're taking these beautiful photos and they're basically reinventing haiku for a brand new audience. And it's exciting. You might have heard this poem by Maggie Smith called Good Bones, which I'm going to try to read for you all. It was a viral sensation by just about any measure. It's very difficult to actually get hard numbers on how often things are shared, but everyone agrees probably about 1 million times this poem was circulated in some way. It ended up being read in its entirety on an episode of Madam Secretary. So because it kind of went viral on Twitter, Twitter and Facebook and these places. Tumblr, I've never signed into Tumblr, so don't talk about it, but Tumblr maybe. It became kind of widely popular. And I'm just going to read this beautiful poem after taking a water. Everyone's good? I want to know your animal myths before I end. All right, so I'm censoring this ever so slightly for the younger students. But this poem is called Good Bones by Maggie Smith. Life is short, though I keep this from my children. Life is short, and I've shortened mine in 1,000 delicious, ill-advised ways. 1,000 deliciously ill-advised ways I'll keep from my children. The world is at least 50% terrible, and that's a conservative estimate, though I keep this from my children. For every bird, there is a stone thrown at a bird. For every loved child, a child broken and sunk in a lake. Life is short, and the world is at least half terrible, and for every kind of stranger, there is one who would break you, though I keep this from my children. I am trying to sell them the world. Any decent realtor walking you through a real dump chirps on about good bones. This place could be beautiful, right? You can make this place beautiful. It's nice to see that it's so popular, right? Oh, I meant to put this up while I read it. This is the beautiful cover. Maggie Smith's Good Bones, and of course, as you could probably guess, this poetry collection is also quite popular, and you can pick it up at most bookstores right now carrying it. Speaking of bookstores, bookstores are also growing in popularity, which I would say relates to this phenomenon. So we've had the rise of these mega online retail places, right? So I use Amazon. I grew up in Wartrace, 5 miles from here, and you better believe I wouldn't use Amazon if it had been available. It's a long drive to the closest store, as you all know. So there's this nice kind of efficiency offered by this operation, but at the same time, people seem to be craving kind of more authentic connections and more authentic experiences, and bookstore popularity is definitely on the rise. So this is from NPR, a study that was done between 2009 and 2015. Independent bookstores grew by 35%. So I know that you are coming from all over the world, but raise your hand if you've been to Parnassus Books in Nashville. Okay, a good number, I love Parnassus Books. Parnassus Books was founded by Ann Patchett, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. And she said that she didn't want to live in a town without a bookstore. So whenever, I'm going to forget the name of it. What was the nice little bookstore? David's Kid, thank you. When David's Kid closed, she said, well, I don't really want to live in a city that doesn't have a bookstore, so I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to open my own. And I had the privilege of interviewing her a few years ago. And let me tell you, I've never been more nervous about anything. I sweated completely through my shirt, which is gross, but it's true. But she was so delightful, and I asked her, why? What do these particular stores add to the community? Why do we need a bookstore? And she had this kind of lovely answer, which I'll just abbreviate. You can read the whole thing. And basically, she was saying you can't have a social experience at the Gap. You can't have a social experience if you're just looking for a pair of pants. But at a bookstore, it feels more than just this kind of consumer need for objects. Her store, as you might know, has dogs. They have lovely dogs. So they have, I think, 3 or 4 shop dogs. You can go in, you can pet the dogs. They've got a children's section, which is just delightful, where children come and spend time. And it's an outing. You can spend an hour there on everything that the store has to offer. My argument is, it relates. It's this balance. So it's exciting to live in a time where we have all this information in our hands. It's exciting to live in a time where we can need something, order it, and have it arrive in 50 days. But there's this kind of deeper part of ourselves that we can fill with bookstores. We can fill with art. We can fill with poetry. So my latest collection collection of poems is all the Bayou stories and with Drowned. And I can remember exactly when I started writing this book because it was in response to this 2009 headline from the New York Times. So it was 5 children presumed dead in Houston flash floods. It's a very tragic story. I lived in Houston for about a year, and it floods very often, as we know now from the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. But even kind of a hard rain can make the streets flood because it's built on bayous, so basically swamps. And these 5 children went missing, and the people were looking for them, but they weren't really optimistic about their fate. This story really, as it probably does you all, kind of grabbed me by the heart. It's such a terrible story. I was thinking about these children, I was thinking about their families, I was thinking about the people who had to go out and look for them. What an important job, but also what a difficult one. The next day, I tried to find out what had happened. What was the conclusion to the story? And I couldn't. Because of the 24-hour news cycle, this was no longer the story. So no one was talking about the flooding anymore, and I don't quite know what happened. I don't know if this happened to have a happy ending. It would be nice to pretend that it did. So I decided that I would write a poem exploring the uncertainty, exploring these mysteries. And I'm going to read to you the title poem from this collection. So I sort of started imagining their story as a fairy tale, and that's how I proceeded to try to understand what had happened to these children. So this is all the Bayou stories and with Drowned. Even the fairy tales resort to air machines, as if we can't keep our boys and girls above water for very long. The blurry shoreline, here is safe, but here's not. Or let's blame the tree light. It slithers and makes us call our neighbors. But there really isn't anyone out there. The real haunting is the light itself. Everything else ends with decision. Skull crushed, heart stopped, lead. Even aphids make patterns that can't be imitated, cut into lace. And the circles get smaller in the search as the townsfolk crawl into other landscapes. So that became kind of the building block of this collection. The idea being, I wanted to write a poem basically about survival. So it comes from a story, but I was thinking about how hard humans fight to survive. We get up every day and we pursue our dreams. You get up every day and you are thinking about where you might want to go to college. You're thinking about what dream career do you want to have. You're thinking, my friend's having a bad day. How could I help her have a better day? All of these things are remarkable when you consider how fragile humans are. It's actually kind of a little bit of a tiny miracle. You all got up this morning and you decided, I'm going to pursue my life, whatever that is. It's pretty astounding. It's something that I come back to again and again, how remarkable the human spirit is. So, that about ends my not fight between poetry and 24-hour news cycle, the balance between poetry and 24-hour news cycle. So does anyone have any questions and is brave enough to ask them in such a large, intimidating environment? Yes?
Are there any poets that you would recommend on Instagram?
I'm not that familiar with Instagram poetry. I know that Ruby Carr's kind of the most famous, and that's nice because her books are all carried in bookstores, so being able to purchase them. I will say but the poet I always recommend for anyone who doesn't read a lot of poetry is Ada Limon. So I mentioned her once already, but she is extraordinary poet, but very, very accessible. And if you're looking for you're thinking, oh, maybe I want to try out poetry, 100% recommend any of her books, but particularly Wright, which was her second class. She has a really fun poem about horses. We're in horse country, so that's a good place to start. Yes? write every day because you kind of imagine what the characters are doing. It doesn't quite require that doubt, which is hard. Doubt, sort of letting yourself be comfortable with doubt is, it's not an easy skill, but it is something that I think is necessary for creating art. But yeah, right, I try to write every day. Yes?
How do you feel about the pull between sort of online books and publications and physical books and publications?
Well, I think there's been some good news, right? It's good news from my perspective lately, which is that physical book sales are actually up. So people are actually going kind of back to paperback books, particularly hardcover, which I always find surprising because hardcover is expensive. But they do last a long time, so they last a lot longer. But what I say is, however people are reading is good with me. So I don't mind if people are reading poems online. I mentioned Maggie Smith's poem, Good Bones, was shared, via the internet mainly. So I think that they can both coexist happily, I suppose. Yeah, even though I love a good hardcover.
Have you heard of blackout poetry?
Not only have I heard of blackout poetry, but I'm going to teach it today to Mr. Barrett's class. I'm so excited. It's also called erasure poetry, and I love it. I think it's really exciting. I love the history of erasure poetry. If you're not familiar with that term, you take a pre-existing text. If you're thinking towards publication, you usually want to find something that's out of copyright, just to be practical about it. And basically, you erase any of the text that you don't want to be seen, and you create your own poem from it. So they can actually be really beautiful art objects at the same time if they are brand new poems. So I find them really exciting. Can you write them? Once. All right, maybe you can write one today. Yes.
What inspired you to be an author?
That's a really good question. So I think that the story's kind of sad. That's why I had that dramatic pause. I was in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and I was living downtown. And when I evacuated from my building, I was in school. I was in college at the time, and I had a copy of T.S. Eliot's book, War the Quartet. And because I was not able to return to my dorm for 6 weeks, that was the book that I had. So I read it about a dozen times. I read it probably 2 times a week. And I found it to be such a comfort. I found that this idea that we are often, no matter the generation, no matter the time period, often wrestling with very similar situations, very similar sorrows. To me, I found it very comforting, and that's actually when I started seriously considering being a writer. That's a very good question. Thank you. Yes?
How do you keep yourself interested in writing?
It's difficult for fiction, right? Do you write any fiction? Yeah, it's tough. It's very hard. Well, I think that first of all, acknowledging that that's something that everyone struggles with. There's actually a term for something called the murky middle. And if you're in the middle of the book, that's the hardest part to write because you don't have that excitement of starting a new project, and you also don't have the end in sight. So it's my tricks are kind of twofold. One is if you love the characters, doesn't mean they have to be likable, but if you love the characters, you can get up in the morning or late at night whenever you write, and you want to see kind of what happens to them. And also, kind of relates to the idea of daily writing. If you're even able to write just a few sentences every day, you keep that momentum moving forward. And that's really how you get to the end of a large project. Thank you for your question. Yes? I do, yeah, absolutely. I think that, yeah, lyrics can definitely be poetry. Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize last year. Yeah, Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize last year, so I definitely think that songs can be poetry. And just like, I always say, when people tell me they don't like poetry, which is strangely something people tell me a lot, I start by saying I love it, and I say I hate it. Poetry is so vast. So if you don't like one type of poetry, it doesn't mean that you're not going to like a different type. So just listen to music. We have classical music, we have pop music, we have country music, we have jazz. The same actually exists in poetry as well. So I love that question. Thank you. Yes.
Where do you get your inspiration for fiction characters?
That's such a good question. I write murder mysteries, and I was teaching English at school in New York City and became really fascinated with undercover work. So in New York City, which is again a city of 9 million people, there are only about 100 people working undercover at any time. So it's a very kind of small part, a very small part of the department. And then most of those people are not going into what's called deep undercover. So really just maybe a dozen or less are kind of embedded into these situations where they are pretending to be kind of working for kingpins, or they're pretending to work for these terrorist cells. And they sacrifice years of their lives. They fully assume that other identity. So imagine that for 2 years, for something that you believe in, you can't have a family, you can't have friends. Your whole life is pretending to be this other person. And so that, for me, is where I got the idea. What happens to someone when they're tempted to that? And my books kind of start with a character who's been undercover and is now trying to make a life for herself. Thank you. Great question. I don't remember what you
That's probably about that.
All right, thank you all so much.